evening, everyone, and very warm welcome to our talks, a series of talks on, on the works of mercy, being the hands and heart of Christ. So tonight, I'm delighted to welcome and introduce an old friend, I'd say, who...
Not that old.
I'm old. Who is... a minor canon here at the cathedral, so you may have seen him singing the office so beautifully for us. But tonight he's come to speak on the work of mercy, which is called Visit the Sick. Dominic is the vicar of Holy
Broadstairs.
Holy Trinity Broadstairs? Got it right, Holy Trinity Broadstairs. But tonight he's speaking from his wealth of experience as a hospital chaplain. So Dominic, thank you very much for being with us. And
thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you, Emma. The first thing that struck me as I looked at the programme, of course, for the series of talks, was that, of course, the series is taken based on the quotation from Matthew 25, and I thought I might just remind us of that briefly. I was hungry and you gave me food, I was thirsty and you gave me drink, I was a stranger and you welcomed me, naked and you clothed me, I was sick and you visited me. And this evening, as you will know, the parish parochial clergy, as I am now one, part of their charge is to visit the sick and care for them and take communion and so on, and that remains, probably less so since the pandemic than before, for what are probably quite obvious reasons. But I thought this evening that I would try to focus really on the aspect of my own ministry and work, which has particularly focused on a day-by-day basis in visitation and care of the sick. And so for some 14 and a half years, I was the trust lead and senior chaplain at the North Middlesex University Hospital NHS Trust in Enfield, in Middlesex, Edmonton, there on the North Circular Road. If you drive around the North Circular Road, you'll see it if you're going north on the left-hand side, you can't miss it. Huge building that used to be a workhouse, the old Edmonton workhouse, and then became a military hospital during the First World War, and after that what we call a DGH, a District General Hospital. And that was where I spent some 14 years of my life. I have to say, for me, that was the most formative of my thus far ministry of 36 years, I would say, and probably the most important. That's not to sort of set aside any of the other things I've done or what I'm doing now. Someone asked me recently what had been the most important part of my ministry so far, and I said without even thinking, my time as a hospital chaplain and caring for people in that sort of environment. And when they said, well, why was that? My answer had to be because I felt then I was doing most what I was ordained to do. So I just sort of let that float for a moment, as we begin to think together. But since the inception of the NHS that we all love so much in 1948, chaplains like myself have been part of its story. There was a time when chaplains were summoned to come and take tea with matron, followed by a perambulation around the ward to console, to support, to inspire patients who required quite long periods in hospital for recuperation, recovery, and for rest. But those days are long gone. Matron no longer hosts mid-afternoon tea, and even if there were such a thing, the chaplain would be very unlikely to be able to attend. Such is the pace of hospital life now. The NHS has changed, chaplaincy has changed, and the resources, of course, are far less bountiful than anyone might imagine. The challenge of my own world as a hospital chaplain for 14 and a half years was as diverse as any occupation could be. as I rushed to respond to the constant demands of the bleep, which was always strapped to my waist. Bleep number 642, which the switchboard knew, and the matrons all knew, and the director of nursing knew, and if ever you wanted the chaplain, you would bleep straight away. And it went, and it went, and it went, and I rushed from one place to another. And this great bleep 642 could take me from the bedside of the fit 23-year-old brought lifeless into casualty, to the young mother with breast cancer whose prognosis was poor, to the loving father of 3 young children whose sudden brain hemorrhage had placed him on life support, or to the man with a once incredible memory, now diminished by dementia and unable to recognise his devoted wife of 48 years. These were just a handful of the literally hundreds, if not thousands, of encounters I witnessed in my years as a hospital chaplain, and where professional, skilled and able chaplains continue to respond today 24/7. As a parish priest, I now surmise how easy is the life of the parochial clergy when compared with those who for 8, 12, sometimes 18 hours a day, and with often very little sleep if you're on call, enable the ministry of the church to be focused in our hospitals, our hospices, and our care facilities up and down the land. And chaplains hold such a privileged role, it seems to me, and are enabled to do the work they do precisely because the founders of the modern NHS had the wisdom and the practical common sense to see that health, and here my quote is as defined by the World Health Organization, that health is a dynamic state of complete physical, mental, spiritual and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. I think that's a very important quote. Clinicians deal with disease and infirmity. Chaplains, together with mental health and other allied health professionals, pick up on much of the rest. And not only for patients, but for their relatives and increasingly for hospital staff members too. But I'll come back to that in just a few moments. For in hospital and away from the comforts of home and society, of family and friends, the patient journey is not always an easy one, especially for those confronting serious or life-threatening illness, disease or injury. In hospital, people often face those ultimate questions about life and death. They search for meaning in the experience of suffering, loss, loneliness, anxiety, impairment. And the patient is forced to address, perhaps in many cases for the first time, the realities of the human condition. And all of these things, I think, play a crucial part in the journey towards wellness. Chaplains are both trained and skilled in responding to these needs. Very often, chaplains meet people at a point where what we might call their secure mini-narrative has come unstuck. Through illness, through fear, through bereavement perhaps. And constantly what chaplains are trying to do is to help people to find that thread of their own narrative again. To be able to feel as though they are the tellers of their own story, not simply the focus of the narrative of clinicians. To find that their meaning and their significance as patients and their role in their own life stories has not suddenly been ended by illness, even if that illness is deemed terminal. Chaplains, of course, also help to anchor the mini-narrative, not just of patients, but of hospital staff too, whose lives are just as fragmented as those of the patients they serve. And for proof of that, I will tell you that I had to deal with not one, but 3 staff suicides during my time as a hospital chaplain at the North Middlesex. That suggests that chaplains themselves stand somewhere secure. But as a matter of fact, they are not immune either from the babel of society and the pressures life brings. Chaplains' personal stories, because they too are human beings, are also often in drift, with no secure overarching story of priesthood to secure them. And even though they might feel very secure in their own sense of vocation and calling to ministry within the health service, they are aware that their narrative is not always convincing or even comprehensible to many of the people they work among. That's one of the factors of sector ministry, I think. It's true for those who work in industrial ministry or any area of ministry. It was one of the first things I had to do when I went to the North Middlesex Hospital. I'd never been a hospital chaplain before, and you're faced with, there were at that time, about 6,000 people on the staff, about 800 beds for patients, etc., etc., etc. Most of those people come from non-religious, non-faith backgrounds, and therefore their expectations of you as the chaplain who go round wearing a collar and so on, and of your role within that institution are very limited, and therefore you have to immediately determine what your role is going to be and how you are going to relate within that. And the church helps you to some degree, and your experience and your background, your training help to some degree. But it was interesting that for the first 2 or 3 weeks when I was there, the bleep never went, hardly ever. There'd been a delay of 6 months between myself and my predecessor, who sadly had had a nervous breakdown, occasioned apparently by the job. But the expectations were low, and everything within the hospital environment is immediate. So if the bleep goes and you don't respond, within half an hour forget it, because the situation has passed and moved on, or other people have taken control. So chaplains spend perhaps too much time, more than is good for any human being, I think, trying to justify their existence in that very, very secular environment. Not only their existence, but also their paycheck. Like other healthcare professionals, they have to gather data, to draw up questionnaires, to manage people and budgets and volunteers, to talk about customer satisfaction and management practices in a way that often sits oddly with their identity as priests and as ministers. This is not, of course, what most chaplains went into it for, any more than it is what most doctors and nurses went into it for. And consequently, I determined that so many in the health service, both chaplains and others, are now suffering from a kind of institutional depression, born of overwork, of their roles being misunderstood or not understood at all, or of having to spend a lot of time doing something they don't actually believe in, when the things that they do believe in are crying out to be done. But there seems less and less quality time available, not least for qualitative, dignified and decent patient care. And those who have been in hospital as patients recently tell me that that is their experience of their hospital stay, by and large. So what in practical terms then do hospital chaplains actually do? Well, here I jotted down very quickly before I came a number of experiences into a list, and which I think characterise my daily routine. Trauma, critical care, I'll say something about that in a minute. End of life care. Liaising, often on behalf of families and with family members, with the organ donation transplantation team. Bereavement support. Would you believe it? Weddings. People get married in hospital. Usually, and sadly, tragically, when a patient is unlikely to survive and they've never actually married their partner. The partner may be recent, I once took a wedding in hospital where the couple had been together and lived together for 40 years as man and wife, but they had never got married. And now the doctors had determined that the patient had a life expectancy of about 3 weeks. And if they didn't get married, then the other partner was set to lose his home and all the sorts of things that they had built up together over so many years. Hospitals, unlike churches, aren't of course licensed places. So if you face that sort of situation, you've got to move pretty quickly to try to get a special license for the sort of, maybe the palliative care room where the wedding is to take place. And that you do via the Registrar General and also via Lambeth Palace and so on. But time is of the essence. So that's one of the things which several times, sadly, I was involved in and had to do. Neonatal and maternity support, very important. Unfortunately, not many children are lost in childbirth these days, but it does happen. And it happened especially in that area of Edmonton, N9, North London, where there's a lot of poverty and, you know, people living sort of under the radar, you might say, where they don't have an identity officially, and many don't even have a hospital, you know, have the automatic right to NHS treatment, and then they suddenly fall sick and somebody brings them to the hospital. So there's all that to deal with too. Funerals. If someone dies in a hospital, anywhere within the hospital grounds, whether on a ward, in a bed, or even just in the parking lot, and they do not have relatives and or the means to arrange for their own funeral, it is the responsibility of the NHS to ensure that they have a decent funeral service, cremation or burial, and it is the hospital chaplain responsibility to effect that, usually very early in the morning because it's cheap. So I would go to the Islington St Pancras Cemetery, sometimes as early as 6:30 in the morning. In the winter it would be dark, it could be snowing, it was pouring rain, and I would stand and wait with my black cloak wrapped around me, and in the distance I would see bright headlights coming towards me with 1, 2, 3, 4 hearses, sometimes with 2 bodies in each hearse, and I would simply be given a name and the age of the person I was to bury. And that happened. Some were cremated, but if there were no details of the name of the deceased and their relatives and so on and so forth, they had to be buried, not cremated, in case at some later stage someone came along and laid claim to this person. So that goes on, that's part of hospital life. Chapel services, of course, staff support, well-being in the workplace was an important part again of what chaplains do, and patient experience. There's a patient experience group chaplains are nearly always part of. Education and learning, both for yourself in service training and also for staff. The chaplain is often part of the induction team for when new nurses and junior doctors come to the hospital, by way of explaining the purpose of chaplaincy and why you're there. Training for doctors, and I set up a course in that, simply called Breaking Bad News. Doctors are not always the best people to tell people they have life-limiting or life-threatening conditions, and the way in which that's done is very important. So I set up a whole series of sort of role-play afternoons when nurses and junior doctors would take it in turn to sort of play a part in these sort of role plays in order to help them to understand from the patient's point of view what it's like to hear bad news. Chaplains are always budget holders, accountable to the trust. They facilitate the rest of the chaplaincy team, arranging their holidays, arranging always that there's on-call cover 24/7 in the hospitals. You're probably part of the Hospital League of Friends, patient representative forums and so on. So that was just a list of the sorts of things that characterize a regular day for most hospital chaplains, not just lead chaplains. I think most would take on some of those responsibilities. But beyond all of this, the chaplain as a priest or minister in all of those many and diverse contexts must be involved with anchoring each individual story, I believe, as a priest, in God's story. And whether that be in the patient bedside or in the staff canteen, you may be a fully trained, hopefully competent healthcare professional, but you are first and foremost a priest or minister too. And God's narrative is to start with God, and you have to remind yourself constantly, working in that secular environment, of who you are and whom you represent. You're not there simply as yourself, but as a representative of the church. Christian theology wants to say that the physical world is unequivocally made for goodness and delight. Pain, sickness, and death have no ultimate place in God's world, and God, of course, never wills that anyone should suffer. So when you're dealing with those inevitable questions on an almost daily basis of why has God let this happen to me, why is the world against me, questions that chaplains meet every day, we must always be very careful not to give easy or glib answers. For very often, of course, there just are no answers, and I'm sorry if that sounds like a cop-out, but it's true. God, in my opinion, longs for everybody to be well. The chaplain's role must never, of course, be about evangelism or conversion, God forbid, but it is about trying to help people to find meaning and value and purpose within the context of their current narrative, and to find hope and strength within it, though that may not always be possible. But most of the people that chaplains work with get their sense of being valued and of finding meaning via their existing relationships. And as a chaplain, one of the most basic things you're trying to do is to re-establish the reality of relationships, which sometimes look as though they're being broken by illness or by stress. Often the patients who ask you, why is God letting this happen to me, do have a point which you do need to be able to tackle. It's a very human and entirely rational question, though I have to admit, as I've already suggested, that I've rarely been able to provide a straight answer, perhaps because ultimately there just isn't an answer. Under that kind of pressure, in at times potentially life-changing or indeed life-threatening circumstances, people can show rare qualities which are both moving and inspiring. But chaplains equally know better than most that suffering and fear can actually destroy personality and character too, that they are not always conducive to growth, and again, I suppose for what seem to be quite understandable reasons. And I've come to believe that chaplains need to be better theologians and stronger in their faith than those who work within more recognised church structures. I just want to say that again, that I've come to believe that chaplains, hospital chaplains especially, it will also, of course, be right and appropriate for those in other non-sector ministries. But from my own experience, chaplains need to be better theologians and stronger in their faith than those who work within more recognised church structures, such as being a parish priest. Those who work within parish ministry, and that's not a doddle, I think, by any means, but at least work within structures that support and understand theology and faith in a way in which secular institutions on the whole don't. And that is my point, really. And I'm drawn to see parallels here between chaplaincy and what we now call fresh expressions of church. In fact, I've sometimes suggested to people that chaplaincy provision in the health service is one of the oldest fresh expressions of church. Indeed, to my mind, I think chaplaincy invented it before anyone else did. One of the primary motives for fresh expressions is the realization that if people won't or can't come to church, then church must go to them. And as a chaplain, of course, you have no choice about that. Either you are church where you are, or there is no church where you are. You can't say to people outside their normal structures, in a hospital for instance, say that they should go to their mosque or their church or their synagogue or their temple for the support they need, because they just can't. They are forced to be where they are. And if people are to meet God and to find the significance of whatever experience it is that they're undergoing through their illness, then it has to be here in the hospital, which is where they are now. It is either here and now, or perhaps never and nowhere. Most people, when asked, say that when their time comes, that is when the end of life comes, and chaplains spend a good deal of time in end-of-life care situations, working closely with the palliative care team, most people would say that they would like to end their days in the comfort of their own bed, in their own home, surrounded by those things which have given their lives meaning and with those they love. And yet, sadly, a recent report notes that some 82% of people who die every year in this country, 82%, do so in either a hospital or a care home. And lack of funding for community-based end-of-life care has to be, I think, a large reason, part of the reason for that, together with the increasing breakdown of traditional family-based support structures. I think those are the two main things which stop people being able to enjoy their final hours in the place where they want to be. There's far too little by way of what we now call advanced care planning. And it's not, of course, just that we're living longer, but that people are also dying over a longer period. And if only we could finance and put in place the right kind of support for that, then tens of thousands more people could perhaps have their final wishes granted each year. Chaplains are often involved too in quite complex discussions regarding advanced care planning for, say, a terminally ill hospital patient. And it is the chaplain who will often make referrals for additional support and help to local church communities where practical socio-spiritual resources may be available. I think in closing, I want to use of chaplaincy the word vocation. Priests and ministers working in our hospitals have a clear vocation which is quite different, I've always believed, from that given to the parochial clergy. It's a very, very different sort of ministry. In my hospital tenure, it was not unusual for me to attend 6 or 7, maybe sometimes 8 deaths in a day. Some among the routine trauma cases which arrive via A&E with labels for the coroner like DOA, dead on arrival, DID, died in department, BID, brought in dead. And these will be people of all ages and situations. Not all people who die in hospital are old people, far from it. And therefore, it seems to me that this is quite definitely a specialised area of vocation, and that one could not undertake it otherwise. This work of supporting those affected by trauma, sickness and death, and with whom you travel as a chaplain along a very difficult road. And yet it also, for me, as I said at the outset, was one of the greatest privileges of my life. And probably for me, the thing that ultimately I believe will characterise my ministry, and not that I worked in some grand places of which I tried to keep quiet on the whole, or did other jobs that seemed to people more important. Finally, the National Health Service, which once promised to make available holistic medical and nursing care for every single inhabitant of these islands from the cradle to the grave, that was the great phrase used when the National Health Service was created, it's having to adapt more than ever before to a changed world and to a dramatically changed political, economic and financial climate. The NHS as we have it now is no longer affordable. This is what we're being told, and we're going to have to look to different aspects of healthcare for ourselves as we get older. The founders of the NHS in 1948 cannot have pictured for a minute the advances, the developments and the changes that we have seen, not all of them admittedly for the good. But if the NHS is to survive, and that's quite a big question, if the NHS is to survive, and if chaplaincy and the provision of professional, holistic, pastoral and spiritual care, that is chaplains, is to survive as part of healthcare provision, then it will need constantly to be reminded of what seem to me to be two timeless truths. First, that as human beings, each of us is a wonderful combination of the physical, the mental, the social and the spiritual, and that each of those parts present needs which deserve a practical and wholesome response. And secondly, we need to be reminded that to heal the sick and to make people well again is a vocation, a true collaboration with the Creator God, from whom ultimately all true health and wholeness comes. Thank you for listening.